In today's workshop here in the AUI, we gathered people from very different backgrounds, NGOs, policymakers, industry representatives, academics, to discuss the interactions between different climate policies that exist in the EU. There are many policy instruments that conform European climate policy. The EU ETS, energy efficiency policies, renewable promotion devices. And of course, this means that interactions, complementarities between them arise. In my presentation, I gave a general overview of the issue and I provided the results of the existing literature on these interactions between policy instruments. And now follow some highlights of our conference.
So on the question of the interaction between the EU ETS and additional policies, it's very important what assumptions we make. One core assumption is if the EU ETS cap is exogenous or endogenous to the political process. If it's exogenous, then we know that additional policies only tend to depress the EUA price, shift emissions in time and space, and reduce efficiency. If we introduce the assumption that there are additional market failures, we also know from climate economics there's a good rationale to have these additional policies which need to be phased out over time as the market failures diminish. However, if we have an endogenous cap and if the price may escalate in the future because we have a too low price today because of the lack of credibility in the system, there's a risk that the future cap might be adjusted and somewhat relaxed. In that situation, member states have an incentive to introduce additional unilateral policies so as to avoid price spikes in the future and to enable a future ambitious climate policy when it comes to decarbonization and zero emissions. Therefore, you have this additional rationale for unilateral climate policies. A price collar in the EU ETS would enable member states to reduce emissions without depressing the price, without having or losing effectiveness of emission reductions due to emissions shifting to other member states. So a price collar would be a suitable reform also to address interactions with additional policies and also the long-term credibility issue of the EU ETS.
Although IETA would have a strong preference for a single policy instrument, so ETS, to drive decarbonization and deliver abatement at the lowest costs, we realize that the other policy instruments are in place and are there to stay. Policies driving in energy efficiency and promoting renewables are put in place already or planned to be introduced in a number of countries that are planning to meet the INDCs that way, along trading schemes that they are planning to have in place sooner or later. For instance, in Brazil, Ukraine, Turkey, and all these countries are looking on a combination of measures to deliver the climate Paris objectives. And therefore we recognize that solution must be found on how to deal with these policy interactions. And we recommend strong close monitoring of how these different policies interact, on how they impact emissions trading functioning. And we recommend mitigating the effect they might have on the ETS, decreasing its effectiveness. That can be done by, for instance, auto-adjustment mechanisms similar to MSR, but there is a room for discussion on what would be the best tool to ensure that. It's also very relevant that the transparency is provided. So we are aware on what policies deliver what abatement options and what is the cost of emission reductions they can provide.
The first thing we have to consider when we talk about policies interacting with each other is what is the goal we want to achieve, why we have them. In this case, what we want is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but do it in a permanent way. That means changing into a low carbon society. In the Paris Agreement, we committed to carbon neutrality in the second half of the century. And the power sector has an important role to play here. Changing the power system model is not easy at all. It needs many policies to be developed, including putting a price on carbon. But also developing other decarbonization policies, energy efficiency, renewable energies, and so on. So, for example, let's think that we need in Europe almost 50% of renewable energy in power generation in 2030. And that is a big challenge for renewable energy integration, and it needs many policies to be developed. Policies that modify the balancing and dispatch rules, also the ancillary services markets, capacity payments, and also to give space for storage and for aggregators that deal with distributed generation and so on. So that is policy, and they will interact with each other. And if they are successful, we will have less allowances in the EU ETS. And it is key here to have a fast response from the ETS. The supply needs to be decreased. And so that means that the ETS has to adapt. And it should do it automatically. It should do it automatically to avoid these long decision-making processes we are having now. So, in favor of agility. If we do that, we will have a price on carbon, we will comply with the Paris Agreement, and we will be fighting effectively against climate change.
I think with the February events, with the Council and Parliament settling their positions, the ETS policy framework is by and large set. The first trilogue meeting is today, and it will continue throughout the spring. But the question is now what happens when other parameters for sure will change. It's not all about the policy design here. So even if the ETS policy framework is more or less settled in big terms, the question remains what if emissions, so the demand side, much lower than in our base case scenarios where we predict prices and forecast prices. So what if national coal phase out, for instance, are more aggressive than what we assume at the moment? What if the Parliament has its way to have a 40% energy efficiency target? What if the renewable penetration is more rapid, or the renewables uptake is more rapid? The question is whether the MSR could cope with these kind of overlapping or interacting policies. I don't think it's so much about avoiding these policies to happen. They will be there, and there will be a need for them, and there will be a drive from governments to put in place other policies. The key is the awareness of the effect they would have on the ETS. And in my view, the MSR is, at least for now, the obvious tool at hand, or the only tool probably at hand to counteract this effect. And I have less faith, so to speak, in involuntary action from member states. The policymakers has this tool at hand, and they have the decision points to tighten it, the MSR review, for instance. And there's also this option will always be there. It really boils down to the political will to use it and to set the ambition at the right level.
Hi, today we were at the Fraunhofer-Institute where a number of key stakeholders were discussing how interaction of policies matter for the development of climate, and in particular the ETS. It was really interesting. We had academics, we had people from the business communities, and we had NGOs interacting, making clear that interaction matters. Also, I think making clear that the elements of the energy and climate change package as put on the table have that interaction and recognize that. There was discussion on what the role of the MSR is, and it certainly can improve the functioning of the ETS in the context of the existing surplus. And by and large, I would say it was an interesting afternoon. It's clear that the project here, the Fraunhofer-Institute, will continue to work on that, and we're looking forward to the results that we will get from this research project that will try to look at the empirics by next year when the project ends. Thanks.
We have discussed today at this very interesting workshop the interactions between climate policy and complementary policies like for renewables, and I'm sure in order to get investment certainty we need both, and in order to reach the European climate targets we will need a strengthened ETS with market stability reserve, well designed, and we need long-term investment certainty for renewables and also energy efficiency. Thereby, we need competitive elements to be strengthened and market integration to be strengthened for renewables. But on the other hand, we need long-term contracts and certainty for investors to reach our targets. And I'm very confident that we can integrate renewable policies which are effective and efficient with an effective European climate policy.
So it was definitely a very interesting event, I think, at the cutting edge, as you would expect the Florence School of Regulation to be. We looked in the morning at how the ETS is interacting with other policies. I think as we get more familiar and more confident with the tool and the way it works, we still need to better understand how the tool introduces itself in the wider policy context. So in that sense, we did look at how the emission trading system interacts with capacity mechanisms, energy efficiency, renewable energy support, but also to alternative to the ETS, which is carbon tax or price signals. And I think the later part of the event was especially interesting because it was looking at what are we going to do about it. And emerges, it came out some interesting ideas. The governance system that the European Commission is putting in place is definitely going to help a lot by providing very useful information to both policymakers, but also market actors like ENEL that actually looks at the market balance to understand how the price evolves. But of course, you also need some ex-ante coordination among member states. They need to understand the impacts that other energy policies in the renewable energy space and the energy efficiency space, the impact that these policies are going to have. So the real key word here is interaction, cross-sectoral interaction, how the ETS is going to interact with the transport sector, with the electricity markets. And one of the conclusions was, well, of course, we do not have price certainty for carbon because we do not have price certainty for electricity. So of course, until we do not get better clarity on how the electricity market in Europe and the energy market in Europe is going to evolve, it's going to be very difficult for the carbon market to internalize that information and actually deliver a credible long-term carbon price. And so in that sense, the MSR, which is a new market stability reserve mechanism, was found to be a pretty good instrument to do some adjustment. But of course, it can never actually replace better coordination in devising and developing the policies. So we do need renewable energy policy making, energy efficiency policy making, energy security policy making to be talking to each other and better coordinating.
There's currently a lot of discussions about prices in the European emissions trading system, and basically that low prices would lead to the assumption that the market is not functioning. We don't believe that this is the case. Rather, we believe that prices are just a function of supply and demand, that any price forecasts are extremely difficult, taking into account the different developments of commodity prices, but of course as well technological innovation and policy overlap. The main concern from our perspective is conflicting policies, because those conflict directly with the European emissions trading system.